Thank you. My name is Clayton Weimers. I am the executive director of RSF USA, which is the DC-based affiliate of Reporters Without Borders. We're an international NGO devoted to press freedom and the right to reliable information for every citizen. And I think one of the things that keeps us all up at night, aside from journalist safety and the threats to press freedom happening at the political level, is the existential threat to journalism that is coming from big tech companies who are rigging the digital information space against journalism. And I don't think there's a figure in big tech who exemplifies this phenomenon more than Elon Musk. And so that's what we hope to talk about a little bit today, but also expand a little bit on the larger threats that are coming from big tech that face journalism. And we could not be more privileged to have a better dream team of a panel to talk about these issues. Patricia Campos Melo is the editor-at-large and columnist for Folha de São Paulo, the largest newspaper in Brazil. She has reported extensively on Elon Musk and X in Brazil, Brazil being one of the only, if not the only country in the world that has so far stood up to X for its disinformation. Courtney Ratch is a journalist, author, and scholar, an expert on the ways technology impacts journalism. She's the director of the Center for Journalism and Liberty at the Open Markets Institute, where she produces and oversees cutting-edge research into news media market structures and helps design smart policy solutions to protect and bolster journalism's financial and editorial independence. And finally, Anya Schifrin is the director of the Technology, Media, and Communications specialization at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. She's a leading thinker and commentator on media sustainability, AI, and publishing, as well as mis and disinformation, and most importantly, a member of the board of advisors of RSF USA. So I want to start with something Elon Musk tweeted out right after it was confirmed that Trump won the election last year. He tweeted out, "You are the media." So my question is he right? Anya, is the future of media more like X than it is like the New York Times? And does that mean journalism is becoming irrelevant?
Thank you, Clayton, and thanks everyone for being here, and how great to be with Patricia and Courtney. So many things to say. I do think that Twitter, X, Musk, has definitely affected how we think about news and how we consume. And I think really maybe most worrying is people's attention spans are now gone, and people don't reflect before they communicate. So I think that whole toxic thing of saying nasty stuff on X has become the way people communicate all the time now in like WhatsApp groups and chat. But even more worrying is, I think it's not just that X and Elon Musk are doing so much damage to journalism, but they're really doing so much damage to the world. To prepare for this panel, I read Character Limit, which Natalia Viana told me about, which is one of those sort of journalistic TikTok-y accounts of how Elon Musk ruined X. And it's so exactly like what he's doing right now to the US government. This idea that you just go in and tear everything up and you don't think, you just destroy, I think is really, really frightening. And in the US right now, we're really experiencing that. Just last night, there was a report that they're about to cut another $700 million of science funding from Columbia University. So, you know, these tech bros that believe in what's called the Dark Enlightenment. They believe in techno-feudalism, and I think they're really ready to kind of just tear everything down. I don't know that many of their supporters, but the ones I know live in a completely different information universe. So they actually think it's all very wonderful and that Musk is just doing something really important, and later on he's going to rebuild and restructure. But we know from what he did to X that that doesn't happen. They really just destroy. I guess my final thought, and I know that we'll talk more about this, is it's so delightful to see his share price collapsing, his Tesla sales collapsing. You know, obviously Europe is just going to have to create their own weaponry and get away from Starlink. You know, once everybody's dead and subservient to this techno-feudal dystopia, they won't actually be able to buy cars anyway. So I hope that one day the Democrats and the people on our team will take over over and tax the hell out of him until he has to leave our country. So that's my opening comment.
Anya, I'm glad you brought up Europe, and Courtney, I want to come to you with this because, you know, you could argue the two greatest spreaders of misinformation in the world have teamed up in Donald Trump and Elon Musk, but they're also enlisting the support from other titans of the tech industry to their team. And so I'm wondering, you know, what are the solutions to misinformation in a world where some of the most powerful men are actively the spreaders of misinformation, the enablers of misinformation, creating the system that's perpetuating misinformation? Is there a solution here in Europe that we can look to?
Thank you for the question, and again, thanks for such a timely panel. I think one of the reasons that the mis and disinformation issue has become so prominent is because our information systems are highly concentrated and dominated by companies like X, like Meta, like Google, Microsoft, and I shouldn't say like, because it is those companies. There actually are no other companies like them. They are the most highly valued companies in the world, run by the richest people in the world, which makes them immune to a lot of the normative pressure, to political pressure, and to regulatory pressure, because they can spend so much of their funds lobbying, you know, paying off politicians who might otherwise regulate them. And I think one of the challenges that we're seeing now is, whereas there was some appetite to, you know, put in place digital regulation, you know, Europe has the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the European Media Freedom Act, the AI Act. This is now being equated with anti-Americanism and with censorship. And now you see this effort to export this very warped and distorted sense of the First Amendment, which, just to clarify, prevents the American government from restricting speech, to equate this effort to regulate your own digital information space, your own digital markets, with censorship. And unfortunately, I think that Europe is so beholden and entrapped by these platforms because they're not only we're not only talking about the visible social media part of it, right? You've got 3 American companies that dominate 67% of the cloud infrastructure in Europe. You've got, you know, a handful of social media companies that, you know, control kind of the information circulation, the algorithmic manipulation of visibility, of monetization. You've got 2 companies that dominate the ad tech infrastructure that determines the viability of alternative information sources like quality journalism. You've got, you know, 2 companies that control, you know, all sides of the market here, and the third one is Amazon, another American company, which is rising up. So I think that, and then of course there's Starlink, which dominates satellite and low Earth orbit satellite. And I would just also add that Meta and Google are both getting into the underwater sea cables business. And, you know, we talk about this as if these are, you know, the internet just kind of exists in the air, but there is physical infrastructure which is dominated by a handful of companies. And then there is the kind of flow of information, which is also controlled and manipulated by these companies. So we know, for example, that Elon Musk used his algorithmic amplification engine on X to amplify AfD, Germany's right-wing party, posts during the election, that he has used it to promote Donald Trump, that he has, now we all get to follow him if you're still on Twitter, sadly. And so I think if you're thinking about what can Europe do, first of all, it has to double down on enforcing its laws. DMA, DSA, these are not like voluntary ideas. These are laws. And so these should not be open and weaponized in the trade war. I think that they need to stand strong and take a page from Brazil in standing up to these tech titans, because if not, they are going to lose all control. right? And we see that these companies are now not complying with voluntary frameworks. So you need hard law, you need competition policy, and I think that's where we've seen the most success, is using the existing laws that we have on the books, competition policy, antitrust, breaking up these companies. It is very possible. In most of history, the communications platforms and other platforms like railroads, transportation, these kind of core infrastructure platforms have been regulated akin to public utilities or to common carriers. They have been prevented from self-preferencing their own products or their own, anti-competitive self-preferencing. They have been prevented from operating in multiple lines of businesses. And so I think there are tools in the existing toolbox that can be implemented to break up the power of these tech corporations. Similarly, you've got to tax them so that you can feed the public coffers, so that you can pay for the data privacy authorities, so that you can pay for the regulators to have oversight. I think you can enforce transparency requirements, and you have to enforce copyright. Right now, it's an imperfect solution for the AI era, but we are not requiring that these companies that are now, again, coercing us into this system of AI innovation to pay for the data that they're using, that they're strip mining all of us, our personal data, as well as journalism and everyone, expressive content that you've ever put online, and claiming it for their own, to monetize that, and then to constrain and coerce us into this, seemingly inevitable march of artificial intelligence. And so Europe has the copyright directive. There are text and data mining exceptions, but they do not apply to commercial entities. So we need to see enforcement of competition policy and copyright and breaking up the power of these companies.
Please. Yeah, I think that her response certainly deserves applause. You said a number of things that I'm hoping we can come back to and drill in a little deeper on. One of them was this idea about the United States exporting malicious models to the rest of the world. And so I want to come to you, Patricia. There's a lawsuit right now in Florida that really seems to be one of these export attempts to impact Brazil's attempt to regulate the information space. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about that for those who aren't familiar.
Thank you, Clayton. Thank you. It's a huge honor to be on this panel with this amazing women and men. I'm going to start by saying maybe not everybody knows and should know. In August last year, Supreme Court in Brazil blocked X. I think it was the only country to do such a thing, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, depending on who you're talking to, you think either, it's an authoritarian government just restricting free speech, or it's a government trying to rein in, unlimited power of big tech. The reason X was blocked in Brazil was because it disobeyed court orders. The Brazilian Supreme Court and electoral authorities, ever since the 2022 presidential election, had been ordering content and account removals because of spreading of electoral false information. In Brazil, just like in the US, we had a violent attempt to overturn election results. In Brazil was January 8th, 2023. In the US was January 6th, 2021. So after that, and during the electoral campaign, electoral courts and the Supreme Court were issuing rulings of content moderation. You might argue, we might argue, that's not ideal that you have the judiciary system of a country, having content moderation orders or decisions. But the reason this is happening in Brazil and maybe in many other countries is because big tech blocked any attempts to regulate through legislation. In Brazil, since 2020, we had at least 5 attempts, 5 bills in Congress that were blocked through massive big tech lobbying. So basically, the only way to regulate or to somehow restrict the power of big tech lays with the judiciary system. So after Musk last year refused to comply with some removal orders, arguing, you know, this is a threat against freedom of speech, and also he basically dismantled X's office in Brazil as to prevent them to be held responsible for anything. Like, they didn't have a legal representative, which is also illegal by Brazilian law. So then the Supreme Court judge ordered the blockage of, it was blocked, X was blocked for a few months, I think 3 months. And after they paid all the fines, they owed fines, and they complied with the orders, they were reinstated. As Anya and Courtney were saying, it's interesting how after having exported this, you know, all attempts to say that any kind of regulation is an attempt to restrict free speech, now, even when there's no regulation, they are trying to impose their view, their extremist view of free speech on other countries. This is what's happening with the lawsuit that Clayton mentioned. There's a lawsuit in Florida by Rumble and Truth Social being President Trump's company, against Brazil's Supreme Court judge who ordered blocking the account and information from an account that belongs to a far-right blogger in Brazil. This far-right blogger was involved in all this electoral disinformation spread in Brazil. And the account would be blocked in Brazil. And now they are saying, you know, this violates free speech in the US. So it's just very puzzling how to deal with this. Maybe our colleagues here can help us. But not only they're not regulating in the US, but they're trying to prevent regulation in other countries, not only in Europe where it's most advanced, but in other, like in developing countries that were trying to do something. And I think this is very concerning.
I was just going to say, to think, Patricia, that one of the first times I heard you speak was here at Perugia, talking about the lawsuits against you and the attacks on you in Brazil, how completely surreal that now, all these years later, it's our country that's doing this. It's really deeply shaming.
And just if I may add, this lawsuit by Truth Social and Rumble, it's actually because of one individual who was one of the main persons leading this hate campaign against me and other journalists. He's been sentenced to pay damages to me, but he fled to the US. He's being protected by the US government. So it is also real.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that if you're comfortable sharing it?
About this? Okay, yeah, sure. There's this hate campaign that during the elections, like many journalists in Brazil were persecuted, as in many other countries. And this one particular person who was the Brazilian court was telling to block his accounts, he was sentenced in Brazil to pay damages to me and many other journalists because he was basically spreading online porn about people. And this is the one that Truth Social and Rumble are saying that deserves unlimited free speech, and that's why they're suing the Brazilian Supreme Court. So it's just kind of ironic. And if I may add, the hypocrisy of this free speech narrative, I can see colleagues over here, for instance, Yavuz Baydar is a Turkish journalist, has been blocked from X. Many Indian journalists, Turkish journalists have been blocked, and in the US, as you guys mentioned, you know, accounts that were critical to Musk were also either shadow banned or blocked. So this is a very opportunistic way of viewing free speech.
Indeed. Courtney, you touched a little bit on what some of the legislative and regulatory remedies are at our disposal right now. But I think there's maybe two other constituencies that people might be interested in thinking about, you know, what can they do? One is the media themselves, and the other is the general public. And so I'm curious, actually, from all panelists, What are your recommendations to people working in media, especially newsroom leaders, on how do you maintain the relevance of journalism in an era where people are increasingly turning away from, information that is sourced with journalistic ethics towards content that's created in all sorts of different ways that's competing with it online? And then I have a second part of this question, but I'll come back to that in a moment.
I think that one of the most important things that journalism should be doing is covering these companies and these people far more critically. So let's be very clear. We now have a techno-fascist regime. Up until this most latest election of Trump, there was an effort either to disregard the government as irrelevant or, kind of work with the government. And I think that now the tech titans have essentially decided to merge with the government. So you have the infiltration of Elon Musk's AI systems into the American government. It's taking all of our data, our proprietary data, your data if you've ever communicated, with anyone in the US most likely, and they're using that to train AI systems. How many journalists in here, or newsrooms in here, are integrating AI? How many of you have thought about the ideologies that are embedded in the large language models that you are adopting into your newsrooms, or have agreed to sign a deal with one of these AI firms so that you can get a few bucks while the rest of the industry gets destroyed through the replacement of referral traffic? Right now we have these generative AI summaries, we have chatbot summaries that are only useful when they are taking the information created by journalism and pairing that with their model to provide more relevant results. How are we talking about AI innovation? How are we covering this idea of AI innovation? I would say most of the media have given in to this dominant narrative promoted by big tech, Sam Altman, Mark Zuckerberg, and the rest, that it is inevitable, and the inevitability of Silicon Valley's approach to AI innovation, which involves the massive theft of everyone's data, is incredibly environmentally destructive, even though we know there are alternative ways to develop things from the Chinese DeepSeek model that are less environmentally invasive. And we are not asking the deep questions, right? So when we came with social media, we all put our information on there. We all use search and YouTube and, social media, et cetera. And somehow we never decided to have a conversation or in the media to discuss, why did we just allow those companies to claim all of that data as theirs? And I'm not talking about just personal data. That's like an easier thing. But when you're using search, you guys are creating joint value. We want to replace all of these jobs. Why do we need to do things faster and more pattern recognition? And we talk about AI as if it is a thing, but it is both everything and nothing. And so journalists should do a better job of actually talking about what do they mean when they're talking about AI. Are you talking about the predictive outputs of a really complicated algorithm, or are you talking about the underlying chips or data? So we need to do a lot better explanatory journalism. And I think that we need to also, as policymakers, get a lot more questioning of some of the assumptions about how we perceive what the problems are. And we have to realize that these tech titans are anti-human, right? They are actually looking to replace humans or to merge humans with AI. They do not see the value of Earth, right? They want to go colonize Mars, they want to do this. They have already given up on humanity and on the Earth. And yet we don't talk about that in this coverage. I would say stop inviting the tech titan leaders to headline your conferences, to lead, to testify before your governments, unless you're, putting them on the hot seat to go, speak at the UN. There's a huge, domestic tech scene in Italy and other countries around the world. Get those other people who have other visions. As a journalist, don't assume that AI and tech is just about this handful of companies in Silicon Valley, and I think that could help.
And just to complete that, if I could steal a point that Chris Wiley made on this stage a couple hours ago, is that I think the news media should probably stop treating tech as a beat, because tech is everything around us in society. The history of human civilization is the development of technology, and to treat it as this siloed topic misses the point somewhat that what Silicon Valley is largely doing right now is not just innovating tech, it's a political movement, and it's a fascist political movement.
And AI is in every sector now. Agriculture is full of AI, right? AI is algorithmic decision making. It is the use of big data and deep learning algorithms. So, every sector is using technology, has AI being, is integrating or innovating with AI. So absolutely, I think you do need a tech beat, but that should be the way that we have a court beat, right? You're covering the legislation, you're covering the people and the corporations, but you also have to cover tech within every other industry.
Mm-hmm. Anya, I've seen you furiously scribbling notes over here, so I want to make sure to get to you.
Yeah, no, I just think it's such a, I don't know what. Whenever there's a problem, journalists always say, what are we doing to fix the problem? So I think journalists always feel like everything is their responsibility. I think all these problems that we're talking about, obviously all of Courtney's solutions are absolutely right. It's also beyond journalism. We have a real problem at this point. And I think that Nathan Heller's piece in The New Yorker in November, where he talked about, it's not even targeted disinformation anymore. It's a whole sort of universe of blah stuff, lies spread by people like Trump and Musk is the problem. But I do think part of how we know about all these problems is because of the incredible job that journalists have done. And so many of those people are here at Perugia. So when I think of what ICIJ has done, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists to expose tax avoidance, and I've actually done studies comparing their reporting and the effect it had to the NGO work. And I think that journalism was crucial. Or look at Natalia Antalava, Global Witness, their board chair is in the front row here, Kirsty Lang. We have so many journalists who've been exposing big tech. Patricia is obviously one of them. So I do think journalists are doing a great job. Right now at Columbia, my students and my colleagues who aren't American are too scared to sign a letter or a petition or to tweet. So everyone keeps coming into my office and going, what can I do, given that I'm terrified, or I'm scared of being deported or questioned at the border? So I've been saying, well, actually, buy a Guardian subscription, pay for the New York Times. We've worried, some of us have been worrying about capture for decades, obviously. I've edited 3 books on the topic, and now, as Courtney points out, what's happened is so much worse than media capture. It's really the next phase of a whole-scale takeover of the government, as well as all the brave journalists who come to Perugia and fight every day around the world to tell the stories that we need to know. Just want to say that as well as the Brazilian government, we've had, terrific regulation out of Australia. Many of you have heard me and Courtney and Patricia other years talking about the bargaining codes, an attempt to get Google and Meta to pay for news. The South African Competition Commission had hearings on whether they should have a bargaining code, and they've just done a terrific report, which speaks to a lot of the points you made about tech power. So I do think that this is a moment for governments in other countries to really, really keep up their sovereignty and passing the laws they need to pass and not being intimidated. And I just want to finally say that the latest, obviously like everyone, I'm checking the news all the time, and the latest New York Times story I saw was that Musk has now fired all the people that oversee safety of self-driving vehicles. So that's kind of thing. I see Kirsty burying her face in her hands. This is the kind of thing now that we're seeing every single day, a new attack on the most basic regulation.
But that's the formula, right? You know, that when he took over X, he fired the trust and safety team. When he took over the American government, he fired all the ombudsmen and IGs and all that. So, you know, it's not that surprising that in a very visceral sense that he's ripping apart the safety infrastructure for you know, something that's very visibly dangerous.
Yeah, and make no mistake, but the privatization of scientific research will be a disaster. All of these large-scale health studies that at Columbia and at universities all over the country have now just been stopped dead in their tracks. And if we end up with zillionaires, you know, donating to their pet medical cause, we're not really going to have public health. I think our colleagues from Africa can really speak to what's been happening over the last few months.
Just on one thing, yes, there's a role for new laws, but I think it's much easier not to have to pass a new law, as we've seen in Brazil with the challenges there. There are a lot of laws on the books that can be leveraged. So it's time to go back to basics. Use the laws that we do have to, first of all, force them to pay taxes, again, break up these anti-competitive dynamics, and we know the problem. We've been talking about the problem of the business model for ages. You know, you have, for example, the GDPR, and that is one of the few reasons why you did not see some of these new generative AI chatbot tools in Europe, is because they could not prevent private data from being ingested and then, you know, regurgitated. So we need to use these tools that we have spent all this time to develop, or that have a long history, and apply them to technology, and not just be like, oh, it's so complicated, it's so different, that somehow this sector, and we need to not give them special privileges. So one of the things many of you probably know about Section 230, it is the protection that the US computer code essentially gives to platforms to publish and not have liability for what is published. So that's so, you know, you can do social media. Well, that's a huge benefit. So they are both publishers and platforms, but they don't have the same liability that any publisher or journalist in this room has. And we exported that as the United States in our trade law for a long time. But then under the Biden administration, they stopped doing that. They're like, okay, actually, this isn't good. We need to let countries regulate their economies. Of course, now it's back and forth and much worse. And when we tried, at the beginning, nobody thought that generative AI output tools should also get Section 230 liability protections. But as soon as we tried to codify that into law, guess who brought out their big guns and started lobbying against it? And so now it's unclear. Now it potentially goes to the courts. Our courts, unfortunately, are also activist, but on the wrong side of democracy, in my opinion. The Supreme Court, at least. I mean, I think there are courts that are still doing their job, but you know, it's a very challenging dynamic now, because we're not only, you know, exporting this protectionism for these American massive corporations, but we're also preventing countries from implementing their own laws. But I also think they have not been creative enough in using, again, these like common carrier provisions, public utility provisions, especially cloud, for example. A lot of countries realize they need to treat cloud as public infrastructure. And that's really important, because right now most countries have their cloud tied to a US corporation that is in bed with a fascist government. That is not a good dynamic.
Patricia, did you want to?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add two things, actually. To what Courtney was saying, it's interesting how big tech wants to have this immunity that is given by Section 230 and its versions around the world. Like in Brazil, we have our version of Section 230 with tiny differences, but it also gives immunity. It also considers that big tech are just republish or distributors, and they're not responsible for the content, right? And this is interesting how they want to do everything at the same, they eat their cake and have it too. What is it in English that you say? In one of the episodes when there was an attempt to approve regulation in Brazil, Google had on its homepage, main search, they put an ad right underneath the search box saying why this legislation XYZ is going to ruin the internet. And they're saying, but we're not really editorial. We can't be responsible for what we carry because we're just republishing other people's stuff. And then at the same time, you published an editorial against the legislation. So it's just like the way they want everything at the same time. And in terms of what we journalists should do, and I was taking notes about what you guys were saying, which I think, yes, we need to be way more critical about the whole narrative. And also, I mean, at this precise moment, I guess there are armies of lobbyists, big tech lobbyists in several countries trying to convince legislatures or governments that it is fair use to use journalistic work or creative work for AI models, that they don't need to pay because that's going to make it not viable and innovation is going to whatever. Or if it's not new legislation that is being considered in the countries or how to apply consumer laws or competition laws, we need to cover very critically the lobbying and the way these legislations or changes in legislation are being negotiated. There's so much in there. I mean, and then it's the thing that only we can do this. We have to do this. What are they doing to try to change legislation to influence not only big tech, but all the interests and, industry? And I think this is really important. It's a service for the reader, the people who are watching. Like, how are these legislation that are going to affect all of us being formulated? Who's influencing them?
Question for Patricia, if I may. So I think one other aspect is about the sort of effect of X on the world is how it's affecting rulemaking. And, we saw what happened with TikTok in Romania, but disinformation spread on X is affecting what governments can do, as Courtney pointed out with AFD. One of my I always have these great Brazilian students, and one of them wrote a paper for my class last week, Mariana wrote, about a tax that Haddad wanted to impose on digital payments, and there was so much disinformation about that tax spread, I think, on X, that they had to kill the bill, and now it's putting a digital levy in jeopardy. And I was wondering, Patricia, if you could update us on this.
Yes, it was actually, we have like a Venmo or Zelle in the US, like this digital transfers of money, and the government was going to start scrutinizing transfers over a specific amount. It was not even tax, it was not taxing. But then you had some Bolsonarista legislators, they went to social media and got huge amplification saying, the government is going to tax this digital payments, which was complete lie. It was a lie, but it was so overwhelming and everybody believed it that the government had to back down, and they're not doing this anymore. So it is, I mean, the freedom, and then you say, free speech, you can't, but this is false, and it's just being spread everywhere.
Well, I think the irony is also that when all these digital payments, Safaricom and all this stuff happened, everyone said, oh, it's going to be great. We can collect taxes. We can monitor. So here's Brazil actually trying to monitor. And all of a sudden, there's just so many lies, they have to pull the bill. And it weakens a very strong politician. Sorry, Courtney, get in.
But I was just going to say on that we should see algorithmic curation as a form of speech. Right? That is an editorial input. So a lot of people can't imagine what does social media look like if you don't do that, right? Is it just chronological? Well, going back to the question around policy solutions, one thing could be to say, okay, well, if you're running a social media platform, you can't also control the algorithms. So you maybe have to have interoperable platforms where anyone can plug in. And again, that's a core principle of common carriage, right? If you create the railroads, everyone can build the trucks that go on them, right? Or anyone can use the roads. So you could have different providers of algorithms, which would then help reduce the spread of disinformation because people would be plugged into different types of information ecosystems. You would have more diversity.
So you talked a little bit before about how it's much simpler to just enforce existing laws rather than try to pass new ones. I'm wondering, is it actually possible within the framework of Section 230 as it is right now to treat algorithmic decision-making as editorial decision-making, or does Section 230 itself need to be reformed?
I think, yes, you need to reform Section 230, and it depends what jurisdiction you're talking about, whether algorithmic curation is going to be considered speech or not. The US, I think it's still ambiguous in terms of, where that line is going to be drawn. But it's not fair, I think, that the US system is forced onto every other country and the way that it is going to govern its information system and its information markets, right? And so that's why I think you need to look at what are your domestic regulations and re-regulating these platforms, not just as, hey, you're, a private corporation. No, you're providing an essential service. The telephone, the telecoms do not get to listen in on your calls. Take all that data, package it with your metadata, sell that to propagandists and advertisers who can then target you, and then use that information to improve their ability to allow those propagandists and advertisers to target you and manipulate you. We do not allow that in telecoms. Why do we allow that in social media? We have media regulations that have restrictions on ownership, for example, limits on being able to own, broadcast and newspapers, or transparency requirements, or fairness requirements. We need to regulate these platforms differently, and we call them platforms. We know they are platforms. They are the platforms on which everyone else is communicating, sharing information, and doing business. And, we're not even talking about the impacts on local businesses, but that is also tied in, right? When we talk about news media bargaining codes, returning value. So these monopolies have been able to get monopoly rents from owning the infrastructure and the advertising interfaces, and they have also helped put out of business the small businesses that used to advertise in media, right? If you look at how Amazon manipulates its marketplace, there's a lot of similar dynamics across these. And these are American companies that leverage their power and immunity to go into other countries and do the same. We saw that with Uber, we saw it with Airbnb, right? So it's not just about the information system, it's about this idea that somehow tech companies are different and apart from any other type of corporate entity.
Can I just add something, just because this alliance between US government and big tech and how they are trying to impose upon other countries, their view of free speech and regulation. When there was this lawsuit from Florida, the State Department had an official statement on X, where else, criticizing Brazilian government, Brazilian judiciary system because it was not respecting free speech. Now, the Supreme Court in Brazil is going to rule on two decisions that are going to change our Section 230, Marco Civil, and it might change the liability regime for big tech. And everybody's sort of bracing for impact because we might expect, retaliation from the US government because, and this is a sovereign decision of Brazilian Supreme Court as to, to what extent big tech should be held responsible in Brazil, but we might end up with, I don't know, visa cancellations, tariffs, or any sort of retaliation against a sovereign decision by a country's Supreme Court.
I want to get to one other constituency because we've talked about what government can do, what the media should do, but let's talk a little bit about the public as well, because for the government to do anything, especially, if we're still living in democracies here, presumably public pressure is what's going to push action in the first place. But can public pressure also create change within these platforms itself. So obviously, Meta right now seems like it's very much captured by right-wing political pressure in the United States. But it wasn't that long ago that Meta, or I guess it was still Facebook back then, was pressured into adopting certain content moderation techniques and oversight, not least of all because its platform facilitated a genocide. And so it was susceptible to the public outcry and the pressure. So is it possible for that pendulum to swing back the other way if there is enough public outcry? Put another way, can we just peer pressure Mark Zuckerberg into doing the right thing?
No, no. Have not we learned that? They literally facilitated genocide in a country, and we still took their money in the journalism sector. We still invited them to speak on our panels. You know, no, they cannot, and especially when they algorithmically manipulate their platforms where all the media tries to reach their audiences. How are we going to build that public pressure? How are we going to build that public campaign? And how do you do that, especially in the country where they are based, when there is so much else happening in the country, when people are losing their jobs, you know, we're imposing these tariffs, the economy is crazy. You know, like, I don't think that's realistic to expect people to have to do that, but I do think, and I've said this for years in these rooms too, you don't have to be on X. You can't really choose not to use Google or Microsoft products because they're the workspaces, they're the cloud, they're, you know, in our productivity tools, and they own, and Meta, you know, the ad tech. You can't actually opt out of a lot of these platforms, but for those ones that you can, we don't need to be on X.
Yeah, I think there's really been a hardening. I think these guys have shifted. They've gotten more crazy. It's sort of like late dictators. Well, actually, late dictators sometimes mellow, but maybe these guys are in peak dictator mode where they've gotten so crazy, so insular, so surrounded by people that support them that I don't know that public pressure is really the best tool at the moment, frankly. And, you know, we missed the boat, right? We should have regulated all these people 20 years ago. The Obama White House was very pro-tech. We let it all happen, or our governments did, and now we're stuck. And so that's why, you know, other countries are going to have to do it. Sorry, we unleashed this huge problem on the rest of the world.
Patricia, did public pressure have any role in X's saga in Brazil, or has it had any, or has the judiciary been leading the charge there?
Well, as of now, to the reverse, I mean, as Anya mentioned, we also had all the attempts to regulate. They were called, you know, censorship, I mean, amplified through social media, these false narratives against regulation or against attempts to scrutinize digital payments. So you had popular pressure against regulation, so, and manipulated and amplified by social media. So yeah, not a happy story here, no.
And Clayton, I think one of the things about Muskification is that it's doublespeak, it's Orwellian, right? It is literally calling censorship free speech. It is calling regulation censorship. It is,
and it's calling speech censorship.
And it's calling speech censorship. Like, it's very difficult in this environment because things are very mixed up. There's this double speak. You can't actually describe what we're seeing. And I think that is really the Muskification of the media that we're seeing now. We are seeing, you know, the Gulf of America and the erasure of diversity, equity, and inclusion being interpreted as we have to get rid of any reference to women, as if somehow we're not just people, right? It's this, and part of this Muskification is this centrality of the white male as the norm, and that is now being perpetuated throughout the media, and I think that's something we're really going to have to grapple with, and to see the media and corporate entities, you know, CBS, NBC, ABC being threatened by the Federal Trade Commission if they don't pay these bribes for some of their editorial choices is really dangerous.
And we have 1 minute left. I want to go to Anya for final thought.
Well, it's okay. Well, I think Courtney wrapped it up well. That's fine. I yield my time.
All right, well. Well, thank you everyone for coming. You know, I'm sorry we didn't have time for questions, but find us afterwards.